The porch light was always on, even when no one ever came. No footsteps, no knocking, just light waiting. My name is Eleanor Whitman. I am 72 years old. For 36 years, I worked as a librarian at a small public library in Ohio. I shelved other people's stories, while mine slowly learned how to stay quiet. The house that learned loneliness. This house was once loud, children running in and out, shoes kicked off near the door, voices calling mom without fear of being ignored. That was before. Now, the loudest sound at night was the hum of the porch light. People used to ask me why I never turned it off. I always smiled and said, "It helps me see the steps." That wasn't the truth. The first night I left it on. The first night I left the porch light on was the night I realized how invisible a person can become without actually disappearing. It was winter. Snow piled up on the steps like unanswered questions. I had called my son earlier that day. He said I'll come by this weekend. He always said that. Waiting has a shape. Waiting looks like sitting near the window with a sweater you don't need. Waiting sounds like a car slowing down that never stops. Waiting feels like rehearsing joy you never get to perform. That night I made soup for two. I ate alone. The neighbor who noticed. Around midnight there was a knock. Not from family. From Mrs. Carter, my neighbor. She held a plate of cookies and said, "I saw your light on. I thought maybe you were expecting someone." Her voice was gentle, like she already knew the answer. The lie I told easily. I said. I had gotten very good at saying that. She stepped inside only for a moment. Before leaving, she glanced back at the porch light. "You can turn it off, Eleanor. It's late." I shook my head. I don't want anyone to feel unwelcome. I surprised myself with that sentence. Pain teaches in quiet ways. After she left, I sat in the dark living room, watching the light spill onto the empty steps. That's when it hit me. I knew exactly how it felt. To approach a door and already know you weren't wanted on the other side. Memories that don't knock. I remembered being a little girl, standing outside my father's study, hearing laughter inside, being told not now. Some doors don't slam, they just never open. The habit that became a promise. From that night on, the porch light stayed on, through storms, through summers buzzing with cicadas, through winters so quiet they hurt. It wasn't for my children. It was for anyone who might hesitate at the steps, the way I always had. What the light meant to strangers. Delivery drivers start saying thank you. A teenager once sat on my steps, crying, until I brought her tea. A lost man knocked at 2 a.m., apologizing for the hour. I told him he didn't interrupt anything. And for once, that was true. The note I started writing. Years later, when my hands began to shake, I wrote a note. I didn't know who would read it, but I knew why it needed to exist. I never turned off the porch light because I didn't want anyone to feel unwelcome the way I did. I folded it carefully and placed it near the switch. What no one knew. How many nights I stood behind the door, listening for footsteps. No one knew that kindness sometimes isn't generosity. It's prevention. Some people leave lights on because they're hopeful. Some leave them on because they remember what darkness felt like. And some leave them on so no one else has to learn. The light stayed on. Even after the voices stopped, people think loneliness arrives suddenly. It doesn't. It arrives politely, gradually, like someone stepping farther away each time, until you're waving at air. When the visits became occasional. At first my children still came. Birthdays, holidays, short visits filled with long silences. They would sit on the couch, checking their phones, talking about places I had never been, and people I would never meet. "Mom, you should get out more," they said, as if the world hadn't quietly closed its doors to me already. The day I stopped asking, there is always a last time you ask. You don't know it's the last time when it happens. For me, it was a Sunday afternoon. I called my daughter and said, "I made your favorite pie." She paused. "Then, maybe next weekend." I heard children laughing in the background. Not mine. That night I wrapped the pie and left it on Mrs. Carter's porch. I never asked again. Silence has weight. Silence is heavy. It sits on your chest at night. It echoes in rooms meant for conversation. I learned to talk to myself, not because I was lonely, but because words need somewhere to go. The library knew me better. At work, people knew my name. They smiled when I recommended books. They asked how my weekend was. Sometimes I lied. Sometimes I told the truth carefully. The library lights turned off at 6 p.m. My porch light never did. Why I understood strangers. I understood people who hesitated at doors. I understood apologies spoken too quickly. I understood standing somewhere, feeling like you were taking up space you hadn't earned, because that's how family made me feel, a memory I never shared. Once my son came by unexpectedly. He stood under the porch light, surprised. "You still keep this on?" he asked. I nodded. He didn't ask why. He stayed 10 minutes. 10 minutes can hurt more than 0. Kindness as a language. Over the years, people started using my porch. A homeless woman rested there during storms. A delivery driver left a thank you note. A teenager once whispered, "I wish my mom left the light on." I didn't ask questions. I just made the difference between being needed and being loved. Strangers needed the light. My children didn't. That truth settled quietly. I stopped being angry. Anger takes energy. I chose understanding instead. The note grew longer. The note by the switch grew into pages. Not accusations. Explanations. I wrote about how pain teaches kindness. How being ignored sharpens empathy. How love doesn't always come from blood. The night, I almost turned it off. One night during a storm, the power flickered. The light went out. For a moment, I felt relief, then fear. I lit a candle, not for myself, for anyone who might be walking past, thinking the darkness meant, "Don't come here." A realization that changed everything. That's when I understood I wasn't waiting for my children anymore. I was protecting others from the feeling they gave me. Some people become bitter. Some become quiet. Some become kind, so no one else has to break the way they did. The house went dark, but the light did not. The last winter, my health declined quietly. No dramatic hospital scenes. No urgent calls. Just smaller steps. Longer pauses. More time sitting near the window. The porch light stayed on every night. Not out of hope anymore. Out of habit. Out of principle. Out of love that had nowhere else to go. The nurse who noticed. Her name was Emily Carter. She was the first person in years to ask why the light never went off. "You afraid of the dark?" she joked. I smiled. "No," I said. "I'm afraid of someone thinking they're not welcome." She didn't laugh after that. She started sitting with me longer. The truth I finally shared. One evening during a power outage, Emily asked me to dictate notes while she lit candles. That's when I told her everything. About the empty holidays, the unanswered calls, the pie left on doorsteps. She listened without interrupting. At the end, she said softly, "That light saved more people than you know." The note by the switch. When I passed away, the house was quiet. My children arrived late. They stood in the hallway confused. "Why is this light still on?" one of them asked. Emily handed them the envelope. The words they couldn't ignore. Inside the note read, "I kept the porch light on because I know what it feels like to stand somewhere. Unsure if you belong. If you're reading this, please don't turn it off. Someone out there might need it tonight. No blame, no anger, just truth. What the neighbors said. At the funeral, people stood up one by one. A delivery driver, a woman from the shelter, a teenage boy with shaking hands. They told stories about shelter, about warmth, about a light that said, "You matter." My children cried, not loudly, honestly. What remains? The house was sold, but the porch light stayed. The new owners were told the story. They keep it on every night. My name was Margaret Wilson. I was 67 years old. I worked as a public library assistant for most of my life. I wasn't famous. I wasn't remembered by blood. But I made sure no one else felt unwanted the way I once did. Final words. Kindness doesn't come from happiness. It comes from survival. And sometimes the smallest light leaves the longest shadow. YouTube ending is requested. If this story touched you, like the video to keep her light on, subscribe to hear the stories that silence tries to hide, and comment below. Who would you leave the light on for? Because someone somewhere is still looking for